Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is the first in a series of 5 reviews that I'm doing on the Super Mario series. I'll be reviewing Mario 64, Sunshine, Galaxy 1, Galaxy 2, and 3D World. Please be aware I'll be covering these games in depth. It's recommended you play them before watching these videos if possible. So without further ado, let's start with Super Mario 64.
It's me, Mario!
Super Mario 64 released in 1996 as a launch title for the Nintendo 64. In concept, it's similar to previous Super Mario games, but this time around made the leap into three-dimensional environments. Things kick off with a simple cutscene to set up Mario's arrival at Peach's castle, which, apart from talking to a few Toads and running into Bowser, is all the story players will get until the end of the game. Since Mario games have never been about their stories, this is a very good thing. It's incredibly easy to pick up Mario 64, start a new save file, and begin playing the first level within a minute or so. Before entering the first stage, the player has to briefly traverse the castle grounds in order to get there. This small addition to the opening sequence is a brilliant way of introducing players to the game. Keep in mind that Mario 64 would be the introduction of three-dimensional games and analog control to many people. The castle grounds allowed players the opportunity of wandering around a safe, relaxing environment while they adapt to the control scheme. It's up to players whether or not they want to avail of this or dive right into the game proper, which is a nice thing. If you're happy to get started, then there's no delay, but if you need some extra time, there's always space available for you to practice things. I know that when I start a new file now, I just head straight inside, but back when I played years ago, I used the castle ground more than once to practice triple jumping until I got the hang of it. The only stage available initially is Bob-omb Battlefield, which is designed to ease the player in further. It's one of the few stages in the game to lack any sort of bottomless pit, even at the edges of the playing field. This means there's no way for the player to be instantly killed inside this level. Even falling from the top of the mountain will only result in some damage instead of death. The only questionable element here is the Chain Chomp, who's one of the most punishing enemies in the game and effectively invincible. Apart from this, Bob-omb Battlefield is a pretty welcoming place, and even the boss of the area, which is required for the first star, has no way of damaging Mario directly. It's conventional wisdom that the first level in a game should be the easiest, so it's no surprise that the developers opted to make it this way. Things get more interesting as the player acquires stars and discovers that the levels don't need to be played in a linear order. Mario 3 and Mario World had already implemented something similar, but Mario 64 blows the door wide open on player progression. Provided the player has enough stars, entire stages can be skipped over or played long after they're initially unlocked. The power stars are the key to this arrangement, literally acting as keys to open more areas. Generally speaking, the more challenging a stage is, the more stars will be required to get to it. This allows the game to have its open structure without sacrificing the designer's ability to control the difficulty level. Mario 64 excels at striking the right balance here. The unlock structure never feels too restrictive, but it successfully stops players skipping directly from Bob-omb Battlefield to Rainbow Ride. There are other ways this could have been accomplished, but using the power stars like keys keeps everything nice and simple. The way the castle hub is set up is also worthy of praise. Rather than presenting the level selection as a separate menu system, Mario 64 allows players to run around and enter levels themselves. Gameplay mechanics like running and jumping can almost be thought of like a language that the player uses to communicate with the game. Since Mario is a platformer, the most thoughtfully crafted mechanics it will have are those related to movement. There's a lot of nice subtleties and additions to Mario's acrobatic skills in this game. Players are bound to get better at it as time goes by, so it's great that the castle allows players to select levels with the same language that they're already using to play the rest of the game. This also means secrets no longer have to be placed inside other levels, instead they can be embedded directly into the hub itself. This has been utilised in some interesting ways, like the hidden entrance to the castle's slide level, the Boo that has to be defeated to get to the mansion stage, and particularly the entrance to Snowman's Land. Even better than those are Wet Dry World, Tiny Huge Island and Tick-Tock Clock, which can be affected by the way the player enters the level. The mechanic for Wet Dry World in particular is the kind of thing I imagine most game designers wouldn't think of until it came time to do a sequel. It's impressive that Mario 64 does so much with its hub world on its first attempt at it. Getting enough stars to progress through the hub involves going into each level several times, which is one of the main ways that this game differentiates itself from its predecessors. Levels in previous Mario games had mostly been one-shot affairs, but the 15 main courses in Mario 64 each have 7 stars, which need to be gathered separately. This stems from 2 major issues. First of all, the cartridge space on the N64 was very limited, meaning the amount of assets it could hold would be quite limited as well. Secondly, the tools to build 3-dimensional environments and objects back then were much worse than they would eventually become. It took a lot more effort to model something simple. This means there's a lot of pressure to maximize the value of each asset. From a designer's perspective, this makes perfect sense, but from a player's perspective, it's a mixed bag. Some levels handle this kind of repeated play much better than others. The best stages are those with multiple ways to get around the environment, as this reduces the repetition that players will have to go through. Whomp's Fortress might be the standout example here. At the start of Whomp's Fortress, the player will have the option of taking the path on the edge, past the moving obstacles, or doing a high jump to skip straight to the upper level. From there, the player can either run up the ramp, or talk to the bob-omb, open the cannon, and fire towards the flagpole. If they run up the ramp, they even have the option of taking a wider path that crumbles, or a thinner path that remains in place. In some cases, the difference between the player routes is small. Choosing the way you want to cross a little gap is hardly a big deal, but it has a significant effect in making the level more enjoyable to replay. Combine this with the fact that players will go backwards and forwards along any of these paths and things start getting more interesting. When it comes to getting 100 coins, most players are going to wander around back and forth, creating a very dynamic playing experience. This is the main reason why I think the 100 coin challenges can actually be some of the most enjoyable, since they force the player to explore all the different paths available to them in both directions. Not all levels fare quite as well as Whomp's Fortress, the 2 swimming ones being particularly bad examples. There may be those out there that enjoy these stages, but I'm not one of them. For me, it comes down to a pretty simple problem. Swimming isn't platforms. If I'm playing a Mario game, and there isn't platforms involved, then I'm probably left daydreaming about when I can start jumping around on stuff again. Comparing the movement of Mario on land to his movement in the water, the problem becomes obvious. On the ground, Mario can walk, run, jump, triple jump, kick, dive, ground pound, backflip, side flip, and wall jump. In the water, he just swims. You can make yourself go slightly faster by timing the strokes correctly, but that's it. In previous games, the abundance of enemies in the water went some way towards making these types of stages enjoyable to play, but they're almost entirely absent this time around. Since the movement in water is so slow and simple, playing the start of these levels 7 times each can be a bit of a chore. Of the more standard levels, I think it's Tall Tall Mountain which suffers the most from this problem. It's not that the layout itself is bad, I actually quite like it, but due to the sheer height, it's one of the most linear stages, which doesn't combine well with the repetitive star gathering. The objectives in Tall Tall Mountain are essentially get to the peak, then press a switch, get to the peak, then grab the monkey, get near the peak, and find the secret slide. There's also less than 100 coins on the mountain itself, which means the slide needs to be done for the 100 coin star too. All of these objectives are a trek from the bottom to the top, with little room for deviation. Tick-Tock Clock is quite similar in its execution, but has a couple of differences which make it much better. Some stars in Tick-Tock Clock gradually get higher, which means the player will have to repeat some of the level, but will eventually have a few new challenges to contend with as well. The rotating and moving platforms are also much more challenging than Tall Tall Mountain, and the various speeds the clock can run at offer some nice variety. Both of those levels share one thing in common, they're both about ascending the environment. In 2D Mario games, the goal the majority of the time was moving from the left to the right. Mario 64 is more open, but this brings with it new design challenges. It's more difficult to communicate where the player should go, so having a large outcrop in the centre of the stage is a good way to grab the player's attention. There are other considerations too. For example, Goombas were already the simplest enemy type Mario had to offer, but in Mario 64 they're even easier to avoid. You no longer have to jump over a Goomba to avoid it, you can simply walk around it. The same is true for pitfalls unless they're so wide that the player can't walk around them. The level designers probably didn't want to litter every level with huge bottomless pits, so the challenge changed to moving upwards rather than moving sideways. Most levels fall into this category, especially if we factor in the interiors of Lethal Lava Land and Shifting Sand Land. This also means that in most levels, if the player makes a misstep, there's a chance they'll land on a lower surface and be able to continue from there. In those 2 levels I just mentioned, this is played with a little bit by having hazardous flooring which can potentially kill the player, but doesn't necessarily do so immediately. This is also why they're placed in the middle of the game rather than the start or the end. They punish player mistakes more than the earlier stages, but less than the later ones which have more bottomless pits. I'm particularly fond of the lava effect, which is dangerous but can also be exploited in its own way to skip over longer gaps in exchange for some health. In contrast, Tick-Tock Clock and Rainbow Ride are placed at the end of the hub because they have the most opportunities for the player to die immediately. Cool Cool Mountain is one of the ones which bucks the trend of scaling mountains by having the player start at the top and work their way down instead. As a result, it's one of the more memorable levels, even though most of the objectives only take a couple of minutes to complete. The teleporter from the bottom to the top also stresses the fact that this level isn't about ascending, since there's always an easy way back up. Placing a decoy penguin near the worried penguin mother is another particularly nice touch. It taunts the player just a little bit and makes the already absurd situation of carrying a penguin down the mountain that much funnier when you realise there's no easy way out. It just goes to show that Nintendo were really on top of their game with Mario 64. As well as contending with the new challenges of three-dimensional level design, they also occasionally demonstrate a grasp of player psychology and use it to their advantage. Wet Dry World is another one which messes with the formula. Even though I dislike the swimming sections, I have to commend the level design in this stage. I'm not particularly fond of the concept itself because it includes a lot of swimming, but the execution is as good as anyone could hope for. The water switches are all carefully placed so that certain platforms will become submerged while others remain above the surface. This really changes the way the player gets around this level. Being in the water has the advantage of full three-dimensional movement, but without Mario's ability to jump on surfaces, activate switches or break blocks, his options are still quite limited. That aside, the first star of Wet Dry World shows just how much this game is capable of underestimating players sometimes. The intended path is to walk across the arrow lifts, but the nearby platform is well within reach of a simple long jump. Keep in mind this level is in the third section of the hub world, after Hazy Maze Cave, which explicitly tells players how to long jump at the start. Even the castle exterior has a sign explaining this maneuver, so it seems like players should have a grip on it by now. If they wanted players to use the arrow platforms at all, they should have spread them out a lot more than they did. The Bowser stages are another break from the norm, offering some of the most focused platforming sections in the entire game. They're also far more linear than the other levels, which is a great way of pacing the gameplay so that it matches the story without being obnoxious about it. Since Mario's goal is to get to Bowser, then he shouldn't be messing around very much when given the opportunity to confront him. These levels provide very little for the player to get distracted by, which lends what little story there is a sense of momentum around these sections. In essence, these levels are like the boss fight before the boss fight, testing the player's ability to get over narrow walkways and spinning platforms. Although they're very satisfying to complete, they're never very difficult, and I think this is because of the way the hub works. Technically, the only mandatory stars in the entire game are the first one, in Bob on Battlefield, and Bowser's sub in Dire Dire Docks. Apart from that, the only other mandatory levels are the Bowser ones. There wouldn't be much point in creating a non-linear hub world where players can select their own challenges if you then force mandatory difficult levels on them at regular intervals. The reasoning is that the most difficult optional challenge should be more difficult than the most difficult mandatory challenge, which makes a lot of sense. The end result is the Bowser levels are considerably easier than Tick-Tock Clock and Rainbow Ride. I agree with this line of thought, but it's a bit of a shame there aren't some more difficult linear levels later on, considering how enjoyable the Bowser ones can be. There's a good bit of variety in the level layouts, but there are even more ways the levels could have been differentiated from one another. For example, courses with an exterior and interior section always start on the outside, so it might have been interesting to reverse that premise and allow the player to emerge into a more open environment after tackling the closed one. Despite some small missed opportunities, the levels on display show enough variety as to never become a slog, and the open nature of the hub world allows players to tackle each one at their ideal pace. Since I'm not a fan of the water levels, I tend to do those ones piece by piece, whereas most other stages I tend to tackle all the stars back to back. The reuse of levels is far from the only area where the team would have to carefully consider the technological limitations of the N64, and, in some cases, make some sacrifices. Apart from the obvious texture limitations, there's the soundtrack, which unfortunately is full of repeat tracks. It's especially noticeable towards the end, since Tick-Tock Clock and Rainbow Ride both use the same music, which had already been used several times in earlier stages. There's a frantic energy to this tune which matches both of these levels, Tick-Tock Clock more so, but the problem is they're both difficult and time-consuming stages to complete. Playing them back to back will result in the player hearing this song at length at least 12 times. Thankfully, the tracks all manage to match the stages they belong to, and some, like the castle theme, are standouts that linger in memory long after switching off the console. It would have been easy to rely on the old favourites to fill out the soundtrack, but instead everything's been crafted anew, which really helps drive home Mario 64 as a brand new experience. As for the other limitations, many objects are represented using sprites rather than 3D models, with varying degrees of success. Generally, the smaller the object, the more difficult it is to tell that it's a sprite, but larger objects like trees can look quite obvious and out of place. It's also a bit of an issue on certain enemies and the boulders, since their two-dimensional nature doesn't give the best idea of where exactly they're supposed to be in the three-dimensional space. Coins, being quite small, don't suffer as much from this, but they have a different problem, a very short draw distance. This can become a nuisance when trying to get the 100 coin stars. Rather than being able to look into the distance and see if somewhere is worth venturing to, you have to go there first just to be able to see if there's any coins. I'm sure the team were aware of this problem, but probably didn't have any way to rectify it. You can tell there was some thought put into this, since the red coins have a much larger draw distance than the yellow ones. They could do this for the red ones, since there's a limited quantity per level, and they're deemed more important. The falling snow in Cool Cool Mountain and Snowman's Land is a particularly interesting effect given the limited capabilities of the N64. As far as I can tell, they achieved this using one of the simplest methods possible. The snowflakes are just little sprites that inhabit the game world like anything else. I speculate that they accomplished it this way because when the player moves the camera around, the sprites all stay in the correct position, which would have been pointlessly difficult to do otherwise. The problem here though is thanks to the limited power of the machine, the sprites aren't occluded by anything else. They're drawn over the rest of the picture, making it sometimes appear uncanny. While the end result isn't perfect, it's probably the best solution they could have managed at the time. I'm curious if this affected the level design in these stages because of the amount of sprites being drawn to the screen. It's notable that neither of these levels have many coins just sitting around, possibly because they didn't want to draw too many sprites. In Cool Cool Mountain, the vast majority of coins are on the slide, and in Snowman's Land, most coins are locked away within enemies. I'm just speculating here of course and might be completely off base, but it seems they decided on the snow effect and built the levels with that in mind. I think designing a game like Mario with a purely aesthetic concern first is a very dangerous move, so they're lucky it didn't seem to have any detrimental effect on these stages. The level designers probably deserve a lot of credit for it. That said, it helps that the level design isn't just carrying the game by itself. The core mechanics are very well thought out and have a great feel to them with a certain sense of momentum to them. This can be credited to a decision made by Shigeru Miyamoto early on in the game's development. Rather than jumping in head first and creating levels and other mechanics for Mario to interact with, Miyamoto focused on Mario himself. The rabbit, which can be found in the basement of the final version, was one of the first things to be created, and early on the team simply placed Mario and the rabbit onto simplistic maps and chased him around. Apparently, Miyamoto continued for a long time to play in a simplistic garden level, trying to make the simple act of moving Mario and chasing the rabbit to be a fun and engaging experience. Now, I'm not one to give people a free pass simply because of their reputation. I think Miyamoto, like any human being, has made some good and bad decisions in his time, but his attitude to Mario 64's development is nothing short of genius. Making the transition to 3D brings so much uncertainty that there would have been no point in making Mario 64 at all if they couldn't first and foremost make sure it would feel good to play. This focus on getting Mario himself right above all else paid off in spades. The movement system in Mario 64 is an enormous leap forward compared to its 2D predecessors, and not just thanks to the extra axis. In previous games, Mario could walk, run, jump, and if he had a power-up, maybe do one or two more things as well. Mario 64 takes those existing elements and attaches a heap of additions, some new and some borrowed. The ground pound feels as though it was pilfered from Yoshi's Island, and the wall jumping may have been inspired by Super Metroid. Wherever these elements come from, they make for great additions to Mario's moveset. The wall jump feels fantastic and makes Mario look like an acrobatic master when it goes well. The triple jump assists in getting to high places and also acts as a launcher for the wing cap. The ground pound is obviously used to hammer some switches into the floor, but like a lot of Mario's abilities, it has more than one use. It can be used to cancel the flying animation when Mario is in the air, or to circumvent fall damage by timing it before Mario lands from a great height. In some situations, the player might cancel the flying animation and pound directly onto a switch, performing 2 actions at once. Similarly, the dive maneuver can be used to instantly achieve some forward momentum, but also to attack enemies or extend Mario's jump slightly. Again, these things aren't mutually exclusive. You can clear out an enemy while building momentum at the same time. As for the long jump, that really only has one use, but it brings a new level of challenge since players now have the option of either jumping high or jumping far. Where previously jumping high was the way of jumping far, they're now separate things entirely. Giving the various moves multiple uses encourages players to use them more often and to string them together. It also simplifies the control scheme since many actions can be mapped to few buttons. Previous games used the directional pad and 2 buttons to control Mario's movements. In Mario 64, that's changed to an analog stick and 3 buttons, which isn't a great increase in complexity considering how many new abilities are available. Most moves can be chained into other moves with little delay, which facilitates moving around the environment smoothly. I think the difference between the side flip and the back flip illustrates the designer's awareness that players would like to keep some momentum in their play if possible. Both of these moves are almost identical functionally, but one is more difficult to pull off than the other. The side flip is faster, but the back flip is easier, so the back flip acts as a crutch that players can lean on if they can't execute a side flip for whatever reason. Assuming the back flip was created first, which seems like the more likely scenario, then there would have been no reason to add the side flip other than smoothing out the gameplay for better players, so it's nice that this was a consideration for them. The subtleties go on, but not all of them are unquestionably good inclusions. Mid-air control was arguably the defining factor in what made the original Super Mario Bros. Such a joy to play compared to its contemporaries. It carries over into Mario 64 too, but with a crucial adjustment which makes it feel quite different. Players can still influence Mario in the air, but the strength of the effect depends on the direction. Moving back and forth along the direction Mario is facing is much easier than moving to the sides. I'd say, as far as the basic control scheme goes, that this is probably the biggest hurdle players need to get over when transitioning from 2D to 3D Mario. The jumps in Mario 64 are a lot more committed than the ones in the older games. If the angle of a jump is even slightly off when it leaves the ground, it's not always possible to rectify it in mid-air. I'm not convinced this was the right decision, and I can't see any reason why the mid-air control wasn't made a little more lax to keep it in line with the 2D installments. It would make the game, as it is now, much too easy of course, but the levels could have been created with more challenging platforms had the mid-air control been more responsive in all directions. One carryover from the 2D installments, which doesn't work quite as well this time around, is the lack of inertial frames of reference. What I mean by this is when Mario jumps on a moving platform, the platform moves out from underneath him. If the game had been programmed in a more realistic manner, then Mario would inherit the velocity of the platform when he jumps, meaning a simple jump would land him in the same location on the platform even though the platform is moving. To think of this another way, imagine a skateboarder pushing themselves along the ground. If they jump directly up off their board, it doesn't go flying out from underneath them. They both travel along together, and ideally the skateboarder lands back on his board with all his teeth intact. I'm not suggesting realism is necessarily the better choice, but I do think this changed the feel and level design of Mario 64 slightly. In 2D platformers, the lack of inertia isn't such a big deal because correcting the jump is a simple matter, but in 3D ones it can feel much more out of place. Combined with the restricted air control I mentioned earlier, it makes jumping on a moving platform in Mario 64 a much more dangerous proposition than it ever has been. I think this is why moving platforms that the player is supposed to ride are few and far between until the last level. Rainbow Ride is fine the way it is now, but I can't help but feel had the physics for inertial frames been implemented, that the carpet rides would have felt more enjoyable, and they could have placed more difficult challenges in its path than what they have at the moment. The analog stick brings with it a myriad of other tweaks that further alter Mario's skills. Walking changes the dive to a kick, standing in place or moving slowly stops Mario from performing a triple jump. You can tell they were eager to see what could be done with a new controller. In fact, some say the N64 controller was designed for Mario 64 rather than the other way around. Whatever the case, there's various scenarios here designed to take advantage of it. Sleeping enemies require some slower movement for Mario to get the drop on them. Now, this is the kind of thing which actually would have been possible in the older games since they had a run button, but it's presented in a much better way here. Using a run button turns the movement into a binary state. Mario is either running or he's not. But with an analog stick, the feeling is entirely different. Sneaking up on an enemy requires the player to balance the stick carefully, which adds some much needed tension to the situation. One slip and it's all over. This brings Mario and the player closer together. They both need to be patient and dexterous if they want to succeed. Other enemies take advantage of the stick as well, such as the eyeballs in the mansion that require the player to run circles around them, and of course Bowser himself, who requires the player to spin the stick like there's no tomorrow. Aside from all the aforementioned things they got right about Mario's controls, there are some other considerations which have been dealt with as well. An important addition is the circular shadow which sits underneath Mario at all times. The three-dimensional rendering of Mario 64 is ultimately filtered down to a flat image on a screen, which raises issues with perspective that didn't exist in two-dimensional games. In a two-dimensional game, both axes can be represented on screen at all times, but in a three-dimensional game, the axes will each have a different amount of screen space depending on where the camera is located. Depending on the angle and the available scenery against which to judge Mario's position, the human mind can have a hard time figuring out where exactly Mario is located in the game world. It's hard to think of a more devastating problem that a platform game could potentially face than the player not knowing where their character is while they're in the middle of a jump. The simple addition of a shadow located directly under Mario at all times does a huge amount to minimize this problem. It's impressive just how many parts of its basic design the game manages to nail completely, despite the fact it was also the series' transition to 3D. That said, despite their best efforts, there's one aspect where the transitional phase shows very clearly: the camera. In the normal mode of operation, the camera has two zoom levels and can rotate around Mario. The rotation is locked to certain angles rather than being fully circular. For an N64 controller, this actually makes a lot of sense since it lacks a second analog, and the grooves at the base of the analog stick make the player more likely to walk in one of the 8 cardinal or ordinal directions. Often the camera will line up in such a way that the intended path through the level sits exactly on one of those directions. Unfortunately, when things don't quite work out right, or if you want another angle on the action, it can be very difficult to get the game to play along. The best way I can describe the problem is that the camera is overprotective. Just for example, in Wet Dry World, if you wander to the back of the stage here, you can't spin the camera around so you're looking the way you came. If you press the R button to move the camera behind Mario, it works fine, but trying to use the C buttons to do the same thing results in an error sound. Similar issues exist elsewhere, and while the secondary camera mode can help circumvent some of them, it often presents a less than ideal viewpoint on the action. It's funny because the dynamic camera is arguably the most revolutionary and influential piece of the entire game. It's hard not to respect it, but I'd be lying if I said it hasn't been bested by later games which learn from it. One thing I will say is casting the Lakaitu Bros as the cameramen was a brilliant decision. It's only an aesthetic touch of course, but it adds a lot of character to the game, particularly later on when you can see one of them in the mirror. This is just another way that Mario 64 took advantage of its three-dimensional stylings to do something a little new. Since we've all been playing 3D games for ages, it's taken for granted that a game will have a camera system built in, but back then it was a much more novel concept. Since it would be a new concept for many players, they might have felt the need to contextualize it the way they did rather than just leaving it unexplained. It's a great example of how new technologies have been able to inspire creativity in games developers. I also think this means that technically this game uses a second-person camera system rather than a third-person one. Occasional camera issues aside, I think it's clear that the core gameplay and controls of Mario 64 are very, very strong. Outside of these core elements, the game is a little weaker, the enemy design in particular. Almost every enemy in Mario 64 is carried over from previous installments, but what worked in previous games doesn't necessarily work here at all. Goombas and Koopas are incredibly easy to avoid and deal with, especially considering that each one gives a coin when killed which restores the player's health. Even the Lakaitu enemies, who in previous games could be an absolute nightmare in some levels, are reduced to little more than a nuisance. With 8 health, coins everywhere, and a lot of empty space, the impact of enemies across the board has been vastly reduced. I think this was also a contributing factor in why power-ups now work differently than before. In Mario 64, they've all been placed on a timer, which makes them less like power-ups and more like temporary challenges. If the wing and metal caps had been in previous games, they probably would have lasted as long as Mario wasn't hit by an enemy, but since that possibility is drastically reduced, they're now on a timer instead. They're all worthy inclusions, and I'm sure many people out there had a lot of fun with the flying cap in particular, but their limited nature means there's only a few stars in the entire game that require them to be used at all. It might have been nice had the caps been integrated some way into the final Bowser level so as to test the player on as many of their skills as possible before rounding out the game. What we get instead is a standard platforming level and a somewhat lackluster final boss which repeats the same scenario from the previous two fights. That said, it feels climactic enough to end the game on, and Mario isn't really about boss fights anyway, so if it falls a little short of expectations, it's no big deal. At least the story itself is rounded out in as simple a manner as its introduction, short and sweet, exactly the way it should be. Nearly everything in Mario 64 is just a little bit different than its predecessors. There's no power-up mushrooms, instead there's a health meter that can be restored by coins. The levels are much more open, and the level select menu itself has been turned into a place for the player to run around and discover things more naturally. Even Mario's movement has been expanded extensively, providing a much greater range of options than ever before. There's a bunch of aesthetic changes too. The bleeps Mario used to make when he jumped around are now vocalizations. The power-ups are all different caps. Stars are no longer about invincibility, and the entire game is supposedly filmed by the Lakaitu Bros. The magic of Mario 64 is that, despite the vast number of changes, it still feels completely like a Mario game. There's a few more puzzles than before, and exploration fills the void left by enemies, but at no point when playing it do I not feel like I'm playing a Mario game. At a time when most developers were still floundering with the paradigm shift polygons brought about, Nintendo not only built a fantastic 3D platformer, but they did it in the style of their flagship series. I've talked a lot in this video about various design decisions and why I think they were made, but the reality is, when playing the game, it's easy to forget about all that stuff. A lot of it just seems so effortless. Unlike many games of its time, it's not some kind of disastrous transitionary game. It's not even mediocre. It's a Mario game. In the next video, we'll be taking it easy with Super Mario Sunshine, so I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for watching.